Hello, everyone. Since the beginning of the genocide, the Israeli regime has killed over 50,000 Palestinians in Gaza. An estimate provided by the Palestinian Ministry of Health that includes over 6,000 unidentified bodies in the ministry's possession and an additional 10,000 assumed to be skilled buried under the rubble. In addition, Gaza is now home to more than 42 million tons of rubble. These ruins include many people's destroyed homes, businesses, and essential public infrastructure. Israeli bombing has also released hundreds of thousands of tons of toxic dust into the air, with long-lasting and deadly consequences. 80% of schools and universities have been damaged or destroyed, and for the first time since the Nakba, Palestinian children in Gaza did not begin school this year. The Israeli regime and its settler community stole a record amount of land across the West Bank over the past 12 months. This theft has been accompanied by increasing violence against Palestinian bodies. Over 700 have been killed, 5,000 injured, and thousands more arrested, bringing the number of the Palestinian political prisoners to nearly 10,000. Most of European countries and the United States of America have adopted statements declaring solidarity with Israel and condemning what happened on October 7th. Throughout the war, many countries stressed their support for the Israeli occupation and its right to self-defense, demanding the protection of civilians and adherence to international law, without citing the Palestinians' right to defend themselves against the Israeli war machine. The hard situation placed international non-governmental organizations in a real challenge to their credibility, as some of them do receive their funds from these countries, and others face many challenges in supporting local organizations. On the other hand, there is a lot of experts still questioning the responsibilities of INGOs in supporting Palestinian local organizations. Hello, everyone, and welcome you to our today's session, INGO Responsibilities in Supporting Civil Societies, Rule or Control. The webinar is hosted by Dalia Association in partnership with Giving for Change as a part of the Shifting the Power movement. It's great to welcome our guest speakers who have years of experience working in non-governmental sector and international cooperation. Our first speaker for our today's webinar is Deborah Doane. Deborah is the author of the INGO program and a key member of Renewal, Reimagining the INGO. Deborah will talk about how INGOs can help address the real needs and priorities of civil society. The second speaker for today's session is Mr. Abdalaziz Al-Salehi. Abdalaziz is a Palestinian researcher who will provide an overview of the context of the civil society organizations in Palestine, with a focus on the different historical periods during which these organizations have operated. Abdalaziz will discuss the relationship with donors, focusing on the challenges related to donor programs and conditional funding. His contribution will also examine the changes in Palestinian civil society organizations after the genocide, the restructuring of priorities within these organizations, and the responsibilities of INGOs in response to these changes, along with the actions that need to be taken. Last but not least, our third speaker for today is Nadine El-Nabli. Nadine is the Associate Director of Programs and Partnerships at MADRE, which is an international non-governmental organization dedicated to addressing the specific priorities and needs of communities in Palestine and other countries. And this is done as a part of the Shifting the Power movement. Let's welcome our first guest speaker, Deborah Doane. Deborah, it's good to have you here, and thank you very much for joining us. And it's over you. You know, the floor is yours with your introductory remarks.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. I'm very humbled to be here, really, and I want to offer my solidarity with people in Palestine and beyond who are working and to try and stop the genocide that's happening right now. Because I'm sitting in London, I want to start by highlighting an appeal that came out 2 weeks ago from the Disasters Emergency Committee in the UK. Now, the Disasters Emergency Committee is a coalition of 15 British NGOs who do a collective appeal in the face of an emergency to coordinate their fundraising for a crisis. Now, let me describe this appeal, because I have to say, it came as a bit of a shock to me. It starts out by showing people pushing their worldly goods along the road and saying that millions of people have had their lives devastated. People are depicted as crying, homeless, helpless. There's no mention of international law being broken. There's no mention of the perpetrators. And they all say, we have people on the ground ready to help. And if you give us 10 pounds or 20 pounds, we'll make sure that they are looked after. It's incredibly patronizing. And I think it exemplifies so much of what is wrong with how the INGO sector approaches their role in civil society and dismiss what is actually needed of them. What we see in the INGO sector in humanitarian and development contexts is INGOs taking the bulk of resources in the international system. One example in another context, in the Ukraine war, a recent study, I think it came out in May, by the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Errors, UN OCHA, tracked of the $3.9 billion in humanitarian funding that has gone to Ukraine, less than 1% has actually reached local actors. That's a staggering figure. To date, the Disasters Emergency Committee, which I mentioned, raised at least 450 million pounds for the response in Ukraine. Much of it is filtered through the priorities of INGOs who are tasked with spending it. Many of them have used it to increase their own staff capacity rather than investing in growing local actors. The expenditures that come as a result of all of this funding that's raised is usually based on the INGO and donor needs. INGOs will spend hours assessing the ability of local actors to take on the funding, and they'll bring in capacity building programs, usually to meet the needs of those same international donors: monitoring and evaluation, financial management, contracting, and compliance. Local actors are often marginalized in the decision-making of how to spend those funds. They're relegated to the role of implementing partners, of INGOs or the donors. They don't get to decide and do themselves. And consultation, when it does exist, is often an afterthought. They're not in the leadership of either UN working groups or INGO working groups. And I heard countless examples of this when I was writing my book, that happened in many other countries, from Haiti to Somalia. There is a lack of solidarity as exemplified by the DEC appeal. What happens is that INGOs are really afraid to speak out, and they're certainly not doing so in that collective guise. So you might get an individual INGO. Christian Aid recently put out a response calling out the genocide, as did Oxfam. But the DEC, the collective membership body that they're a part of, did not. So they end up, as a consequence, being instrumentalized by their political donors. They're responding to their funders and their charity regulators in an effort to appear neutral. So they do basically become instruments of a political agenda through the back door. Now, there are real and perceived barriers that are behind this. So there are regulatory barriers that are facing INGOs. There are compliance procedures that all of the donor agencies require that are top-down, bureaucratic, heavy, and not respecting of local circumstances. There's things like anti-terrorism laws around funding, international law, which requires humanitarian neutrality, for example. And there are perceptions around risk, corruption, safeguarding, and certainly racism as at play in a lot of this. A perception that local actors have no capacity. And certainly in the case of Palestine, I had a conversation about this only yesterday, that people are struggling, absolutely true. So therefore can't help themselves or be in leadership positions or that foreigners are less at risk. Also, neither of those statements are true. We've seen many deaths of foreign humanitarian actors in this conflict. So the question is, what can INGOs do instead? And in the Ringo project and my book, the INGO Problem, I heard loud and clear that INGOs need to take a step back and look at their role and purpose much differently. It's not about aid and charity, it's about solidarity. They've defined their role that's simply about aid, charity, saving people, white saviorism over the past 50 years or more. And that no longer really cuts it. They need to shift power to local actors. If they were deliberately shifting the gravity of power to local CSOs, that DEC appeal that I mentioned at the beginning might look quite differently. The narrative would have been guided by local people saying what they want and need from the international community. Years ago, I was involved in something called the Ombudsman Project, which came out after the Rwanda genocide and looked at the role of humanitarian actors in that response. And this was, some years ago, almost 30 years ago now. And what they said was that they wanted international NGOs to be far more accountable to local actors, to provide a listening function and opportunities for local people to say what they want and need from them. And to also to be able to call out really bad practice too. They want INGOs to co-decide who should take the risks and when. Sometimes it should be local actors, sometimes it should be international actors. There was a great letter that came out, a challenging letter that came out last week from Nadine Saba, who's an NGO leader in Lebanon, about what she wants and what they want locally in Lebanon from international actors. And, she said, we have strong people locally. We have government infrastructure. And now all the INGOs are going around scrambling, doing needs assessments, trying to coordinate with each other. And she said, where were they? This has been on the cards for months and months and months. Why hadn't they invested already to be prepared to help? The INGOs were taken aback. Instead, they're responding in that old-fashioned emergency crisis way. And what they should have been doing for years, in the way that the DEC actors should have been doing for years, is investing in local actors. When going back to the Ukraine example, recently the International Rescue Committee and Save the Children are both laying people off, because what they did when they got all this flood of funding in is they hired people on their staff rather than investing in the long-term capacity of local actors. Two other small points. They need to be focusing more on transparency, reporting what funding is received and where it's going. They do not have that transparency. We can't actually track the funding that they're receiving in appeals and exactly where it's going. And they need to be ensuring that local CSOs are at the decision-making table in any response. We have great tools out there. There's something called Talk to Loop, which every INGO should be investing in to hear what people in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon are saying about their response. And finally, they need to be acting in solidarity with genuine partnerships and investing in local actors. And sorry, that my second finally, this is that we need to also be thinking not about the current crisis, but about the long term. Now, let's hope and pray that this conflict will come to an end sooner rather than later. But remember what's happened in other crises. Haiti, for example, when there was much more, millions and millions of reconstruction and development funding that came into this context, and the INGOs flooded in with their staff, with their resources, with their so-called expertise, and local people were left with nothing. So we need to be preparing now for how do we make sure that Palestinian civil society is at the center in the long term as well as in the short term. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deborah, for these insightful ideas. And driven from your introductory remarks, let me ask Abdulaziz about what can INGOs do and what is the narrative of the Palestinian local actors and local communities. Abdulaziz, you are muted.
شكرا أستاذ محمد على التقديم، وشكرا أستاذة ديبورا على المداخلة، وبانتظار طبعا الزميلة نادين لتقديم مداخلتها. أنا في الحقيقة للإجابة على هذا السؤال لابد يعني من أنه نقدم سرد بسيط تاريخي حول مسار عمل المنظمات الأهلية، خلينا أطلق عليها، في فلسطين المحتلة. وهذا المسار إذا بدي أصنفه هو بصنفه بأربع مراحل: ما قبل أوسلو وما بعد أوسلو، ومن الفترة الواقعة ما بين 2006 إلى الفترة الواقعة 2014، وما بعد 2014 ولغاية اليوم. يعني هذا مهم جدا عشان نفهم احنا كيف التسلسل صار فيما يتعلق بمنظمات الأهلية أو مؤسسات المجتمع المدني الفلسطيني. وطبعا بكل تأكيد أنا ما بتحدث هون عن المفهوم الأوسع للمجتمع المدني، أنا بشكل خاص بتحدث عن السي اس اوز، عن المنظمات الأهلية. تمام. طبعا قبل أوسلو احنا بنعرف او المعظم بيعرف في فلسطين انه تاريخ هذه المنظمات الاهليه هو بعود بالاساس للحركات الشعبيه اللي كانت تنخرط في الفضاء الاوسع او في العمل الاوسع في المجتمع المدني، اللي بتتقاطع في عملها مع النقابات، تتقاطع في عملها مع الحركات الاجتماعيه او الحركات الشعبيه اللي كانت تنشط بالعمل الوطني. لاحقا في فتره اوسلو صار في مأسسه لهذه التجمعات او هذه الحركات الشعبيه، وصار لابد من انتقالها من شكلها الشعبي إلى شكلها المأسسي، خليني أحكي. فبالتالي صار في تحول على بنية وشكل هذه المؤسسات، وطبعا أو شكل هذه الحركات، وطبعا انخفض عددها بشكل كبير في فترة ال 93 94، لكن سرعان ما في بداية المرحلة الانتقالية سرعان ما رجع ارتفع العدد كمان مرة، لأنه بدأت ملامح المجتمع المدني أو مؤسسات المجتمع المدني تتبلور أكثر، يصير فيها مأسسة أكثر، وقانون بنظمها اللي هو لاحقا تم الاستقرار عليه في العام 2000 اللي هو قانون الجمعيات والمنظمات الأهلية. وكان في حقيقة الأمر هنا لابد أن أشير لنقطة: كان في توافق نوعا ما بين النظام السياسي في ذلك الوقت وما بين الأجساد الموجودة في المجتمع المدني على أنه لابد من أنه يكون في فضاء مجتمع مدني حر بتمثله منظمات أهلية مؤسسة ومحوكمة. تمام. الآن اللي حصل بعد العام 2000، خلينا نحكي، صارت انتفاضة الأقصى. في انتفاضة الأقصى صار في تحديات جديدة أمام المجتمع الفلسطيني، هي لا تتعلق في بناء الدولة ولا تتعلق في المأسسة والسياسات وكل هذه التفاصيل، هي تتعلق بالاحتياجات الآنية للفلسطينيين. وصولا للعام 2004 2005 مع نهاية الانتفاضة كان هنا في هذه المرحلة في شبه تدمير أو تدمير شبه كامل للمؤسسات الرسمية وغير الرسمية، ناجمة عن الاجتياحات اللي صارت في الضفة الغربية طبعا، والقصف المستمر اللي كان موجود في قطاع غزة. بعد العام 2006 لغاية العام 2014 كان في عندنا هذه الفترة اللي هي فترة إعادة البناء ما أطلق عليها، أو التوجه نحو مأسسة السلطة الوطنية الفلسطينية مرة أخرى. وهنا كان في دكتور سلام فياض، هو كان أو هو اللي كان رئيس الوزراء في ذلك الوقت. وهذه نقطة في غاية الأهمية. هلا بحكي ليش أنا بفصل هذه الجزئيات. من العام 2006 للعام 2014 هو كان موجود كرئيس وزراء، أو من العام 2007 2008 للعام 2014 هو كان رئيس وزراء. ولاحقا بعد العام 2014 طبعا احنا بنعرف في هذه الفترة في 2011 2012 كانت بدأت ما يطلق عليه بالربيع العربي. تحول المشهد في الإقليم وفي الشرق الأوسط والاهتمام والأولويات لمسائل أخرى في مجتمعات أخرى، وهذا طبيعي وبديهي. بالإضافة لذلك أنه بعد العام 2014 في العام 2016 دونالد ترامب اجى للرئاسة. وفي الحقيقة كثير ناس بتستهين في سردية دونالد ترامب فيما يتعلق بالعمل التنموي، وفيما يتعلق بمنظوره لكيف ممكن يكون العمل التنموي في العالم، أو كيف ممكن تكون شبكات الإسناد في العالم. يعني هي سردية ترامب كانت مدمرة بشكل فظيع، وهذا موضوع كثير مهم لأنه هو مس الأونروا بشكل أساسي. وهذا أعطى مزاج عام عند معظم الدول إنه نعم بصير في اليوم استباحة لمؤسسات كبرى في العالم أو مؤسسات تتبع للجمعية العامة بشكل أساس. فبالتالي هذا بيسهل علينا المساس في مؤسسات مثل مؤسسات المجتمع المدني الفلسطيني، أو السيطرة أو توجيه الاي ان جي اوز نحو مشاريع أخرى. في كل مرحلة من هذه المراحل كان في نسيج وعلاقة تبنى مع المؤسسات الدولية غير الحكومية. ممكن وصفها في العديد من المرات انه هي وصلت حد الصداقه، لانه كمان الاي ان جي اوز كانت في فلسطين هي بتعيش مرات في عديد من الاحيان بتعيش الحاله، يعني هي شايفه الواقع وشايفه الحاله وفاهمه تماما شو اللي بيصير. فهي بتتجاوز المساله مجرد علاقه مؤسساتيه ما بين المؤسسات المحليه والمؤسسات الغير حكوميه الدوليه، تمام. لكن بنفس الوقت ايضا علينا انه احنا ما ننسى انه المؤسسات غير الحكوميه الدوليه هذه هي بشكل اساسي مرتبطه ببرنامج، يعني هي كمان عندها سياساتها، عندها على اجندتها مجموعه من الاهداف، مجموعه من المعايير اللي بتسعى دائما لتحقيقها. وفي كثير من الاحيان كان في تقاطع ما بين المؤسسات المجتمع المدني الفلسطيني وما بين هذه المنظمات الاي ان جي اوز، تقاطع فيما يتعلق بالمفاهيم المتعلقة بالعدالة الاجتماعية، بالحق في الحماية في الصحة، الحق في التعليم، كل هذه التفاصيل. الإشكالية الحقيقية هي كانت أنه خلال هذه الفترات كلها كان في تغييب، هو ربما يكون مقصود وربما يكون غير مقصود، للأولوية الوطنية للفلسطيني. بمعنى أنه ما كان في عمل جدي على الوصول لاستحقاق سياسي فلسطيني يشكل دولة، اللي هو أصلا كل المنظمات الدولية غير الحكومية كانت تدعم بناء على برنامج اللي هو تحقيق حل الدولتين، تمام. وفي ظل الهجمات الإسرائيلية المستمرة، وفي ظل زيادة المستعمرات، وفي ظل الانتهاكات وعدد الزيادة في عدد الشهداء، كل هذا الكلام، كان في نوع من أنواع التدخلات اللي بتنفذها هذه المنظمات. لكن هي تدخلات لا تتجاوز التدخلات الإغاثية في العمل. هي لا تسعى لتحقيق غاية وطنية أو الوصول إلى السقف الأعلى اللي بتعلق بالاستحقاق السياسي الفلسطيني. بكل الأحوال بدي أرجع لبعض الأرقام والمؤشرات قبل ما أحكي كمان عن سردية ترامب، لأنه هذه اليوم إحنا ممكن نرجع نعيشها. والحرب على الأونروا في القراءة الثانية والثالثة للكنيست هي جرمت الأونروا، وهذا مدخل خطير جدا لعمل مش بس يعني هو مدخل خطير مش بس لإنهاء الأونروا، هو كمان مدخل خطير لإنهاء عمل أي ان جي او ممكن تعمل في فلسطين فيما يتعلق بحماية على الأقل الحقوق الأساسية للفلسطينيين في المواطنة، تمام. فبالتالي هو لغاية العام 2021 احنا كان في عندنا 3020 مؤسسة محلية أو مؤسسة مدنية. 754 من هذه المؤسسات هي في محافظة رام الله والبيرة، بينما في قطاع غزة كان في 764 في كل القطاع. فبالتالي تقريبا في محافظة رام الله والبيرة هي كانت تقريبا نفس عدد المؤسسات في قطاع غزة، يعني 22% احنا بنحكي. هذه المؤسسات كلها تخضع لقانون مثل ما حكينا الجمعيات الخيرية والهيئات الأهلية للعام 2000. وبالمناسبة المنظمات الدولية غير الحكومية هي تخضع لذات القانون في العمل في فلسطين المحتلة. آه، 1188 من هذه المنظمات هي بتعمل أو بتستكمل دور المنظمات المحلية، طبعا لمؤسسات المجتمع المدني الفلسطيني، تستكمل دور وزارة التنمية الاجتماعية في العمل فيما يتعلق بالخدمات الإغاثية والحماية الاجتماعية وكل هذه التفاصيل. 525 منها يعمل مع الشباب أو ضمن إطار عمل المجلس الأعلى للشباب والرياضة، و228 هي في قطاع حقوق المرأة وحماية المرأة. وتصنف باقي المؤسسات على كافة القطاعات الأخرى مثل الزراعية والصحة وغيرها من القطاعات. دكتور علاء الترتير وجيريمي وايلدمان كان في عندهم مجموعة من الدراسات اللي رصدت التمويل للفلسطينيين من العام 93 ولغاية العام 2021. لحديت العام 2014 كان التمويل وصل، طبعا هو هنا بس عشان أوضح، هو التمويل مش بس لمؤسسات المجتمع المدني، تمويل كمان اللي هو حصلت عليه أو حصلوا عليه الفلسطينيين من الوكالات الحكومية للتنمية، مثل مثلا جايكا، مثل مثلا اليو اس ايد، كل هذه المنظمات. وصل حوالي 30 مليار دولار في العام 2014، أو أكثر من 30 مليار دولار في العام. من هذا ال 30 مليار دولار 20 مليار دولار كانت من الأعوام 2006 لل 2014، اللي هي فترة انتهاء، خلينا نحكي او بعد ما استشهد ياسر عرفات، او بعد ما توفى ياسر عرفات، استلام محمود عباس الحكم، وكان سلام فياض اللي كان فيها سلام فياض هو رئيس وزراء. هذه الفترة أغدق الفلسطينيون بالأموال، يعني 20 مليار دولار من 30 مليار. وصولا لحديت العام 2021 كان في رصد ل 45 مليار دولار تمويل من 93 لغاية ال 2021. لكن مهم جدا انه نشير انه بعد العام 2014 صار في واضح انه ما في افق سياسي، ما في شكل لدولة فلسطينية ممكن يتحقق. وهذا ناجم عن تآكل الأراضي بين مقتبسين، الأراضي الفلسطينية اللي موجودة في الضفة الغربية، والحصار الممارس على غزة. فبالتالي نزل التمويل، أو في العام 2015 كان التمويل فقط 450 مليون دولار. يعني أنت إذا بدك تقارن مع السنوات السابقة، هو على الكيرف نزل جدا. تمام. وصولا لترامب، ترامب طبعا اجى بسرديه جديده، خطاب مختلف، دمر العديد من السرديات التاريخيه اللي كانوا يشتغلوا عليها فيما يتعلق بحقوق الانسان، في مجال التنميه، في مجال الحريات. وكان هدفه الاساسي ترامب، او هو اكثر نقطه لازم نركز عليها بتقديري، هي مساله الهجمه على الأونروا. قديش هو قطع بشكل اساسي الالتزامات الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية الطوعية تجاه الأونروا، قطعها بشكل كامل في فترة حكمه. تمام. وهذا مهد لاحقا وفتح الباب لمجموعة من الدول في أنها تقطع التزاماتها الطوعية تجاه الأونروا، اللي كانت بشكل سنوي ترسل، أو كانت ترسل بشكل مستمر. وهذه مسألة في غاية الخطورة، لأنه أنت سحب الشرعية من الأونروا، أو تجريمها على الأقل، هو بيفتح باب لتجريم أي INGO في المستقبل ممكن تعمل أو تحاول تعمل في الأراضي الفلسطينية. وهذا كمان في مسألة المؤسسات الستة كان في محاولات إسرائيلية عبر الNGO مونيتور لرصد مين هي الجهات اللي بتمول المؤسسات الفلسطينية اللي ممكن هي تندرج وفقا لإسرائيل تحت العمل الإرهابي، أو تحت المنظمات الإرهابية. تمام، بين مقتبسين طبعا. بالتالي هذا بأخذنا لسؤال كثير مهم. اليوم في عنا حرب إبادة. حرب الإبادة هي يعني زي ما بيحكوا بالبث المباشر تبث. تمام. الأستاذة ديبورا حكت عن مجموعة من العناصر اللي بتتعلق بالحرب في أوكرانيا، وتتعلق اليوم كمان في حرب الإبادة الإسرائيلية على الفلسطينيين. مظبوط، ذكرنا أنه التمويل هو وصل 45 مليار، لكن في سنة واحدة من حرب الإبادة الإسرائيلية على الفلسطينيين، حجم التسليح كان لإسرائيل تجاوز 22 مليار دولار. فبالتالي احنا لنا أن نتخيل أنه في سنة واحدة تسليح هي كانت تقريبا نصف المبالغ اللي أنفقت في أكثر من 30 سنة لمحاولات تنمية ومحاولات الوصول لدولة. وهذا كمان برجع بخليني أسأل نفسي بشكل أساسي، ونسأل حالنا كاي ان جي اوز، ونسأل حالنا كان جي اوز، ايش المسار اللي كنا ماشيينه احنا وكان في فجوات، ايش كان في ثغرات. بعد 30 سنة من التمويل، قبل حرب الإبادة على الفلسطينيين، كانت نسبة البطالة حوالي 30% في المجتمع الفلسطيني، نسبة الفقر في الضفة الغربية 14%، ونسبة الفقر في قطاع غزة وصلت 56%، حتى تجاوزت 60%. وبعد الحرب طبعا صارت 99.5% في قطاع غزة، وفي فلسطين في الضفة الغربية أيضا زادت النسبة. مهم كمان جدا نعرف انه عمل الاي ان جي اوز في الضفه الغربيه يختلف عن عمل الاي ان جي اوز في قطاع غزه، ويختلف عن عملها في القدس المحتله اللي هي تسمى القدس الشرقيه. تمام. ويختلف عن عملها مع المؤسسات الفلسطينيه في الداخل المحتل، في الداخل في المناطق اللي هي 1948 في فلسطين المحتله التاريخيه. تمام. هذا بأخذنا على محل، عشان ما أطيل عليكم، ممكن لاحقا في الأسئلة ممكن يكون في إشي للاستفسار للتوضيح أكثر. باخذنا على مجموعة من التحديات والتساؤلات. اليوم احنا كمؤسسات مجتمع مدني فلسطيني بنسائل حالنا لمدة 20 سنة كان أخذ العمل الطابع، تحول من الطابع الوطني كأولوية وطنية والوصول إلى كيان سياسي ممثل للفلسطينيين، إذا بدنا نعتبر إذا هو قائم على حل الدولتين، لمنحى مختلف تماما اللي هو المنحى الإغاثي، منحى الإغاثي وتقديم الخدمات ومحاولة الحماية القطاعات الصحية والزراعية وغيرها من القطاعات، لأنه كمان في تآكل وفي تراجع وأداء كان سيء للحكومات الفلسطينية المتتالية في عدة مراحل. مثل ما احنا اليوم بنوجه لحالنا هذا السؤال وبنقول انه احنا اليوم طيب لازم نرجع الأولوية الوطنية في حرب إبادة تمارس علينا كفلسطينيين، وحرب الإبادة هذه مش بعيدة أيضا على الضفة الغربية، بالعكس هي يعني بتحصيل حاصل قادمة للضفة الغربية، وعملية التهجير هي حاصلة في الضفة الغربية، وزيادة الاستعمار حاصلة في الضفة الغربية. فبالتالي نسأل حالنا كمؤسسات كيف بدنا نرجع هذه الأولوية الوطنية، تمام؟ وفي نفس الوقت بالتوازي مع الاي ان جي اوز تحديدا الصديقة اللي هي تتقاطع وتتبع لأحزاب سياسية مثلا في أوروبا أو في دول الإسكندنافي، اللي بشكل أو بآخر تحمل مفاهيم العدالة الاجتماعية وتحمل مفاهيم الحماية وتحمل مفاهيم الحريات للفلسطينيين. كيف من الممكن أن نعيد القضية الفلسطينية على الصعيد الدولي لتكون قضية حقوقية فيها مطالب بالحرية وشكل من أشكال الاستقلال، بعيدا عن العشرين سنة الماضية هذه اللي كنا نقدم فيها إغاثة أكثر وحماية أكثر في قطاعات معينة؟ بمعنى أنه مثل ما هي صارت الأولوية لنا اليوم وطنية، كمان الاي ان جي اوز لازم تكون عندها أولوية وطنية أو عفوا أولوية برنامجية ضمن أجندتها، أنه كيف هذه القضية ممكن إحنا نبرزها بشكل سياسي أكثر مما هو خدماتي. تمام؟ أنا بتقديري هذا هو التحدي. المسألة الثانية والتحدي الثاني هو للاي ان جي اوز، هو انه اليوم هذه مسألة بدأت مع طبعا انا ما بتحدث اليوم عن الوكالات الحكومية للتنمية مثل اليو اس ايد وغيرها، بحكي عن الاي ان جي اوز اللي هي تتبع لاحزاب مثلا يسارية، تتبع لحركات او هي على علاقة مع حركات اجتماعية موجودة في اوروبا في امريكا اللاتينية وكل ذلك. لازم تسأل حالها اليوم إذا كان في قضية المؤسسات الستة على سبيل المثال اللي بنعرفها إحنا على الصعيد الفلسطيني، كان في موافقة على الرضوخ والخضوع لشروط تتعلق بأنه لازم يكون في رقابة أعلى على هذه الأموال وين بتروح، هل هي تذهب لمنظمات إرهابية أو ممكن تستفيد منها منظمات إرهابية ولا لا. وفي بعد حرب الإبادة هذا زاد الخطاب، زاد صار حتى الرقابة هي أكثر على المحتوى تبع هذه المؤسسات، وإيش أنا كفلسطيني بشتغل في هذه المؤسسة إيش بكتب أنا عندي في تقاريري مثلا أو في على السوشيال ميديا على سبيل المثال. تمام؟ بتفهم تماما انه الاي ان جي اوز هي في نظام سياسي بحكمها بمعنى انه هي علاقه مع الاحزاب وعلاقه مع الحركات الاجتماعيه، وهذه الاحزاب والحركات الاجتماعيه تاتي تحت مظله سياسيه معينه الدوله بتنظمها. تمام؟ لكن السؤال اذا تم الخضوع في المره الاولى والمره الثانيه بعد حرب الاباده اللي بنشاهدها احنا اليوم بشكل مباشر، طيب ما هي الضمانات عند هذه الاي ان جي اوز انه لاحقا هي تكون كمان اداة، وخليني احكي يتم السيطرة عليها في قضايا اخرى بعيدة عن الملف الفلسطيني؟ يعني ايش كيف تضمنوا حالكم انتم كاي ان جي اوز انه لاحقا ما يتم كمان ابتزازكم في قضايا اخرى؟ يعني خصوصا انه واضح انه اسرائيل هي او دولة الاحتلال هي عندها قدرة وعندها لوبي قادر يأثر حتى على السياسات الدول والحكومات اللي احنا كنا نعتبرها في يوما ما صديقة، بعيدا عن الدول العربية طبعا حدث بلا حرج. ثالثا وعشان انهي بشكل نهائي مداخلتي، آه، المطلوب من الاي ان جي اوز اللي هي بالاساس كمان تاريخها هو بيرجع لمجتمع مدني موجود في امريكا اللاتينيه وفي اوروبا وفي دول الاسكندنافي وكل هذا، ترجع للقواعد الاصليه، تستفتي هذه القواعد الاصليه، لانه القواعد الشعبيه لهذه الاي ان جي اوز او اللي لاحقا تمأسست عليها الاي ان جي اوز في دولها، هذه القواعد هي اللي كنفسها هي القواعد اللي طلعت ورفضت الإبادة الجماعية اللي موجودة، هي نفسها القواعد اللي طلعت واليوم بتنادي بأنه يجب أن يتم وقف الحرب حرب الإبادة على الفلسطينيين في قطاع غزة وفي الضفة الغربية، وتشوف هل الأولوية اليوم على الأجندة فيما يتعلق بالعمل الإغاثي وفيما يتعلق بالعمل السياسي. هل الأولوية أني أنا فقط أحاول مساعدة الفلسطينيين فيما يتعلق بقضايا احتياجهم اليومية، ولا كمان خلص صار في حد معين لازم الفلسطيني يكون في عنده شكل من أشكال الحق أو الاستحقاق السياسي اللي لازم يحصل عليه؟ وبناء على ذلك العودة للقاعدة هذه والحشد اللي ممكن يصير الشعبي في بين القواعد هذه ممكن يضغط على الحكومات لتغيير سياساتها. تمام. احنا شفنا WHO في هذه الحرب، وشفنا اليونيسف في هذه الحرب، وشفنا كمان ايش قدرتها. للأسف الشديد هذه أجساد تم تقييدها بشكل كامل، ما كان عندها قدرة بتاتا على العمل. اللي كان عنده قدرة على العمل في قطاع غزة هي المنظمات الأهلية، وحتى بعض التجمعات الطوعية الفلسطينية اللي اشتغلت، حاولت قدر الإمكان تسد الفجوات في حرب الإبادة. وبكل تأكيد هذه كمان على علاقة مع الاي ان جي اوز، وعلاقة تاريخية، يعني هي مش علاقة وليدة اللحظة. تمام. احنا ما بدنا توصل الاي ان جي اوز اللي بتدعم الفلسطينيين في حقوقهم بشكل اساسي لتوصل لمرحلة يصير فيها مثل WHO واليونيسف هي غير قادرة حتى على انها تعطي موقف سياسي اتجاه اللي بيصير. فهذا الشكل، هذا المسألة أساسية وتحدي أساسي وسؤال أساسي، لأنه هذا بيحدد كمان مستقبل الاي ان جي اوز. مش بس يعني ممكن هي فلسطين، ممكن هي التحدي اليوم، ممكن هي الاختبار اليوم، لكن مستقبل هذه الاي ان جي اوز كلياتها هو بيعتمد على اليوم انت كيف تتصرف في هذه الحالة وفي هذا السنة. شكرا كثير ومتأسف على الإطالة.
شكرا أستاذ عبد العزيز. بالعكس يعني النقاط التي أثيرت من طرفكم يعني مهمة جدا جدا. التحديات والأسئلة هاي يعني مش تحتاج إلى هاي الندوة اللي عقدتها مؤسسة داليا بس، تحتاج إلى كمان يعني جلسات عمل مطولة. لأنه زي ما أنت حكيت وزي ما لخصت في مداخلتك، يعني إذا اليوم فلسطين مثال، الآن في تحديات أمامنا كمؤسسات مجتمع مدني فلسطينية وكمؤسسات كمان مجتمع مدني عالمي. طيب let's go to Nadine. Nadine, as a representative of MADRE, which is an international non-governmental organization that trying to address the specific priorities and needs of local communities through uh, a locally driven development approach. What are particularly, what are the best, let's say, practices and examples that you can share with our audience with a special focus on your experience in Palestine?
Thank you, Mr. Mohammed, and thank you to the other speakers. Really powerful positioning, I think, for this dialogue today. As was mentioned, I'm here representing MADRE, which is a US-based international organization and a long-term partner of Dalia Association, which is why we're also in this space. And I want to name before I start to share a bit about our model and our history and our work, that I think we've all named this in different ways, that we are operating in an inherently flawed system. And by flawed, we mean an imperialist system, a neoliberal system. And so the challenges that we're up against to actually put into practice the principles and to engage with the critical questions that were posed by Abdalaziz, for instance, require a lot of risk and a lot of critical thinking and reflection and creativity about how to navigate these challenging systems. And so I want to also just name that what I'm presenting here is MADRE's model and years of learning in dialogue with our partners. And by partners, I'm referring to local community-based organizations, local civil society organizations, and that we are on an ongoing learning journey about how to best shift power and to use our position of power and leverage that power in a way that allows the centering of the leadership of of grassroots and local organizations. So just to name a little bit about MADRE, I'll talk a little bit about our work and how we understand our position globally, and also offer a little bit of our practices and approaches. And then I'm happy to share a bit more when we maybe have more questions from the audience as well. MADRE is a US-based organization, as I said, that's been around for over 40 years. It started out as a solidarity organization with partners in Nicaragua, and has grown to hold relationships with movements across the world. And we hold two key identities in our model. And I think these are really core to how we continue to address contexts like Palestine today. One identity is that we are a feminist fund or grant maker. So we provide grants to groups, local groups, grassroots groups across the world. And then the other identity is that we are a human rights advocacy organization. And this is inherently different from many other international organizations, especially in many funds or donors that tend to only have a function as an apolitical donor, or advocacy organizations that have only a function as doing advocacy work. So we do both. As a funder or grant maker, we are what is called an intermediary, which means that we are a mission-driven organization that moves resources from other donors, such as individual donors or foundations, to local groups, especially grassroots, small, new, or underfunded groups and communities. And as an advocacy organization, we also work to do campaigning, lobbying, programming, and communication strategies to make local and international law relevant and accountable to the people that it's meant to serve. So really working closely to address international institutions and international bodies and international legislation that are failing, especially groups and communities such as Palestinians, as we've continued to see over the years. We see these two identities and approaches as two sides of the same coin, because in our understanding of what solidarity means, to be in meaningful solidarity with our partners, and if we're really committed to long-term change, then we need to be doing both, resourcing the leadership of local groups and organizations to achieve the change that they define for their contexts and communities. But we also have to be addressing the roles that international, and by international I mean Western or global North countries, play in creating the conditions and causing conditions of harm that result in the struggles and in the systems of oppression that our partners are having to fight against, and that are making it more challenging for them to achieve the liberation that they are fighting for, again, as we've seen it over and over with Palestine. When it comes to specifically Palestine, MADRE has held partnerships with grassroots and civil society organizations since the 1990s. And from the beginning, MADRE has held a consistent political and analytical position. And we always position our work politically as well. It's never apolitical, which is also against the norm of INGOs. And namely that we understand that the root causes of any cycles of violence that we see happening on the ground is directly due to Israeli occupation and the wider ongoing war on Palestine and Palestinians. We've also always held very clearly, and especially because we are a US-based organization, we've held very clearly that the US has been the primary backer of Israel's occupation, has been providing weapons, funding, and political support. And we know, unfortunately, that this remains just as true and relevant today with the genocide as it has since the beginning of the occupation. And we also know, and have made this argument very clear in our campaigning and our lobbying around Palestine, that the genocide that we're witnessing today is a direct extension and acceleration of the Israeli occupation and the apartheid state that Israel has created. And so our role and response in Palestine has always been, again, one, to support grassroots and local priorities and solutions, and centering the agency of Palestinians in their own liberation, which is why we continue to partner with groups like Dalia. And two, leveraging the power we have as a US-based or global North-based organization to do advocacy work that promotes human rights, that ensures the human rights apply to Palestinians, that the collective rights of Palestinians are protected, and to also address US foreign policy. Because again, we cannot ignore our position as being in the US. And so we also have to hold our own government or the government within that impacts our organization accountable for the role that it plays. And so again, I want to underline or underscore that these are really particular, this has been true in our history as MADRE, and it's a very particular model that we continue to uphold in our work. And I think speaks to some of the questions that were raised about the role of INGOs to hold the political lens up against what we typically term humanitarian crises, as if they have no political context, or that there is no perpetrator for that lead to this crisis in the first place. I'll speak a little bit about the model we hold specifically around our relationships with civil society organizations. And again, this is a model that is based on the learning and dialogue we've always been in with our partners on the ground about how they need to be supported. And so I think the main message here also is that we, the Global North, should not be also, even in our attempt to shift power, we cannot be the ones deciding this is how we shift power, right? The decision of how we shift power has to sit with communities on the ground. They have to tell us what that means for them. And that might look differently for different contexts, because also our relationship to those contexts might look different, right? But I'll give you just an overview. So first and foremost, we operate based on trust in our partnerships. And really it seems very obvious, but unfortunately it is not, as was pointed out also by Deborah. And when we see often a lot of funding moving towards Palestinian groups and groups across the world from very racist places, from places that undermine the leadership and expertise of those on the ground, and that impose agendas and ways of doing the work for social change. And so what we do is really the opposite of that. We understand that our partners are the experts, and they're not just the experts on their suffering. They're not just the experts on their needs. They're experts on the strategies for change. And so what that means, directly connected to that, is that when we then fund these groups, we do so in a flexible, unrestricted way. And that means that we're not imposing what they have to do. We're not imposing how they have to do it. We give flexible grants that allow partners to decide for themselves how they want to go about the work they need to do. That might be that it goes towards programs and projects. It might be that it goes towards core and operational costs, such as covering their salaries. It might be that it goes towards emergency response. And we've seen in many contexts, including in Palestine, the importance of having flexible funding and the extreme challenges that are created when they do not have flexible funding, because then when we're in a moment of displacement, a moment of genocide, the response has to shift drastically. The work that they're doing might have to shift drastically. And so being able to pivot and make those decisions day in and day out is essential for groups on the ground. They need to be able to move and make assessments and not have to go back to Global North organizations to check if they can use the money in a different way. Another aspect of our relationships is that we do long-term relationship building with our partners. So again, where there might be a tradition in the sector of having more shorter-term relationships that might be one-year projects, two-year projects, and often within this framing of a project that is being started and completed. We know that the work of social change is not a project. It is a long-term work that requires then long-term relationships. And so we resource groups not on a short-term basis, but on a long-term basis. Every year we continue to renew grants as long as we're able to fundraise to continue to do that. We also approach our relationships with our partners in a holistic way, and that means that we have a care-based approach. We care. We know that we're talking about people also. These are not organizations that exist. They are people that are from the community, that are doing important work, that are also directly impacted by the struggles that they are working to address. And so sometimes that means that the staff or the members of a civil society organization on the ground needs support for themselves also. And in addition to support for the community, they might need support because they might be targeted. And so maybe they need legal support. Maybe there's concerns for their own safety. Maybe they need mental health support because they're working in very traumatizing contexts. And so we also are thinking about the holistic well-being of our partners and not just their function as an implementing partner for a vision that we hold. We also work with partners by having ongoing channels of communication, regardless of the funding cycle, to always have check-ins with each other and to also understand what other needs come up, such as most recently, many partners were telling us they were experiencing challenges around digital security. And so we provided small grants to our partners to work to address whatever those challenges were. Again, without imposing what that looks like, they would decide how to best go about that in their context, because those challenges just look different in every context. Another layer of our relationship is that we see ourselves, and it's really how we understand our positionality or the power we hold. We see ourselves as a connector. Firstly, because we have relationships with many partners or groups around the world, we use that connection we have to connect these partners to one another. And this is often going against traditional models of capacity building. And instead, partners when they want to learn about something, or they're wanting to explore strategies or best practices for something, we look to connect them with other grassroots groups from other places. It might be in their own country, it might be in the region that they're in, it might be groups in Latin America connecting with groups in Palestine, to share those strategies and to discuss ways forward. So it's also continuing to resource the expertise of the people on the ground, rather than assuming that Global North organizations have the expertise to share that are relevant for the context. But we also use our role of being a connector because of the power we hold. We have access to certain advocacy spaces. We have access to international institutions. We have access to specific meetings that our partners may not typically have access to. So we also use and leverage that power to ensure when partners want to do this international advocacy work, that they are the ones in the room, that they are the ones who are representing their own visions and agendas and goals. And when they choose not to, because we also respect that some choose not to engage with international institutions in this way, then we also do our best to represent whatever their visions might be based on our understanding of their work. And we also use our position to do donor education. We are in relationship with other donors, with others in the sector, and so we do what we can to advocate for shifts around the sector, around how to do better flexible funding, trust-based relationships, and directly resourcing local and grassroots groups. I'm conscious of time, but I'll say maybe 2 more points and then I'll wrap up. Another layer is that when we do fundraising, and as was pointed out, there are many challenges around fundraising when it comes to a lot of the contexts we work in, and we're seeing this for Palestine as well. The restrictions, additional restrictions that are being placed on funders that typically resource in Palestine, new restrictions that didn't exist before the genocide that now come into play and impact our ability to fund. Luckily, we've managed to still continue to fund in Palestine, but we have many peer organizations that have lost funding because they were in solidarity with Palestine. In our own fundraising, we are very intentional to fundraise from foundations and donors that would allow us the flexibility to ensure we can maintain unrestricted, unconditional grant making to our partners on the ground. And so that is a choice that impacts. Sometimes we have fewer resources because of that, but we still do that intentionally so that our partners are not restricted in any way. When in some moments we do receive restricted grants, this is only when it's been done in direct consultation with partners on the ground to get their informed consent, and they are directly involved in designing the proposal, writing the grant application with us, and they are the ones driving then the scope of what that project will be, so that the restrictions they are involved in shaping them as well. And so these are ways we try to negotiate some of the power that we have to try to ensure partners are themselves driving these grants as well. When we also put out appeals, and this connects to Deborah's point earlier, our appeals for fundraising is always uplifting what our partners are doing on the ground and not positioning them as victims, but rather as agents of change, as people with solutions, with strategies that are responding regardless of whether we're there or not. They are always doing the work. And so we always try to make sure to position our partners that way as well. The last point is that as I go back to our identity as an advocacy and policy organization, we understand that because we participated, as I mentioned, in the creation of a lot of international bodies and international legislation, we have a specific responsibility to shape them and ensure that they are accountable for what they set out to do. So when it comes to Palestine today, we are, as much as we're sending resources on the ground, we are directly engaging with international bodies to make sure they are held accountable for the lack of how international law is not being held up properly for Palestinian rights. We're working to hold the US government accountable in its role in foreign policy that is continuing to allow and enable the genocide to take place. And so this is work that sometimes is successful, sometimes is not. Unfortunately, we are seeing that's not always where we want it to be, but it is our responsibility. And we know that this puts us in a position of risk to speak out on these issues, but it is exactly that. It's the risk that we have to take on because of the position and power we hold. I think I'll pause here and just thank you for this space and happy to share a bit more in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Nadine. Actually, we don't have enough time for the Q&A. Actually, we just have 3 minutes in order to close up or end up the session. But I do agree with you that, you know, it's not about shifting the power. It's about how we can shift the power. It's not, you know, it's not an easy process. This is why that we might, you know, that maybe we can get some, let's say, recommendations from your part at last words, you know, regarding this issue. How can INGO support local communities in such a way that the process is owned by local actors and who would like to go first? Deborah?
I mean, I think I loved Nadine's last point that you know, sometimes acting in solidarity comes with risks, financial risks. It may come with operational risks, but if we go to the central purpose of what INGOs are for, which should be about acting in solidarity, that as Abdalaziz mentioned, you know, the 20, 30, 40 years of acting on relief programs hasn't really delivered the best outcomes. So I think INGOs could be very much collaborating effectively with local actors in the way that MADRE does, and seeing their positioning, which is very strong politically in the countries where they're headquartered, right? Here in London, the heads of the major humanitarian NGOs, the development NGOs, have the ear of government, of the FCDO. And the same would go for the bigger relief agencies, certainly in the US, that they can be using their voice to educate the public, to educate government, to educate political leaders, and keep that voice alive, even if it comes with the consequence of you might raise fewer funds, right, from those governments, but acting in taking the lead from what local actors want. And that's the primary function, in my view, of the INGO community, is to walk beside, not to decide, which I think is sort of the title of this webinar.
Thank you very much, Deborah. I got a message from my
And you just sorry, can I also make one other point about that? Sorry. The one
Go
thing
ahead.
I wanted to stress is quite often they will say, well, we've got local staff in Palestine. An INGO representative, a local Palestinian representing an INGO, is not the same as local CSOs. They do have different drivers. So I do think we need to distinguish between that. So they do hire local staff, absolutely, but that's not letting local actors lead in the same way.
Thank you very much, Deborah. I got a message from my colleagues from Dalia. Maybe we can get 1 or 2 questions from the audience if they are. I don't know. Shall they write it in the chat box and I read it, or we can open the mics? You know, I have here 2 remarks, one from Mohammed Sadiq, you know, but it's in French. I don't know. Toutes mes félicitations pour cet atelier. You know, it's, he's trying to congratulate us about this webinar and the reflection that being produced as a part of your interventions. And there is another comment here بخصوص مواجهة التحديات اللي ذكرها أستاذ عبد. المنظمات الأهلية محتاجة توعية وإعادة تأهيل بخصوص العمل الوطني الشعبي، لأنه بسبب المسار التاريخي اللي ذكره العاملين في هذه المؤسسات تمحور أهدافهم في خدمة أهداف التمويل، جندرت الأعنف المناخ والبيئة. إذا أنا بقرأ صح. التواصل مع المؤسسات الأجنبية محدود مع الطبقة المثقفة أصحاب اللغات، بيستأصل الطبقة الشعبية زي الفلاحين وأهلنا في الأغوار مثلا. كمان إطار العمل يختلف اعتمادا على خلفية المجموعة. ممكن عبد تعلق على هاي الملاحظة، وإذا بتحب كمان تعطينا توصيات أو كلمة أخيرة فيما يتعلق بالموضوع الأساسي لهذا الويبن.
نعم، هو في الحقيقة يعني هي الملاحظة في محلها بكل تأكيد. هو المسألة مش بس مسألة وعي، مش وعي وإعادة تأهيل فقط، هو كمان يعني أنا على يقين إنه المنظمات الأهلية الفلسطينية هي واعية تماما في الفخ اللي وقعت فيه، أو واعية تماما لوين انحرف المسار عندما تحول من الهم الوطني الجمع السياسي بالأساس، اللي هو السياسي بمعنى مجابهة الاحتلال وإنهاء الاحتلال، لا تدريجيا انه نتحول احنا لاجساد بتقدم خدمات وبتقدم تدخلات اغاثيه وكذا في الاغوار على سبيل المثال، وبيتم التواصل معنا احنا من قبل الاي ان جي اوز، تمام، او بيتم التواصل مع هذه المنظمات الاهليه من قبل الاي ان جي اوز. يعني هو الموضوع بتجاوز ذلك بصراحه. هو كمان الاي ان جي اوز نفسها لما بتقدم خدمات او بتدعم هذه المشاريع تحديدا في الأغوار، يعني لأنه الأغوار هو مثال حي وصارخ، والقدس هي مثال حي وصارخ يعني. و20 سنة من هذا الدعم والتمويل احنا شايفين انه ما في نتيجة. بالعكس الأرض بتتاكل بزيادة، بالعكس الاستيطان بيزيد، بالعكس كل ما مثلا جهة مانحة قدمت لنا خلايا شمسية عشان الطاقة ونوفر الطاقة، بيجي جيش الاحتلال أو بيجي المستعمرين بكسروها، تمام. وبترجع هذه المنظمات الحكومية الدولية، المنظمات غير الحكومية الدولية بترجع بتمول نفس المشاريع من غير ما تاخذ موقف سياسي واضح تجاه ما يحصل. فهنا أنا بعرف إنه في إشكالية، بمعنى مش إنه هي نواياها غير صادقة في الدعم، بمعنى لا، إنه هو السقف اللي أنت لازم تشتغل عليه أعلى من إنك مجرد تقدم خلايا شمسية وتحفر آبار وهذا الكلام كله، بمعنى إنه أعلى من التمكيني، تمام. بصراحة في هذه النقطة كمان بتحمل مسؤولية المنظمات الأهلية الفلسطينية اللي هي كانت عارفة ومدركة تماما إنه هذا المسار وين ممكن ياخذنا، وما رفعت هي سقفها، ما رفعت خطابها في إيش الإشي اللي بدها الاي ان جي اوز تتدخل فيه أو تسندنا كفلسطينيين فيه، وايش بدها كمان من الحركات الاجتماعية حول العالم تحمل رسالة بالنيابة عن الفلسطينيين بين شعبها وبين قاعدتها وبين الأحزاب السياسية الموجودة في هذه المجتمعات. فبالتالي أنا بتفق تماما مع النقطة، لكن هي يا ريت بس فقط مسألة توعية وإعادة تأهيل. أنا بتقديري إنه كان في وعي معين وانترك، يعني انترك الموضوع بصيرورة معينة ما يمشي لحديت ما وصل وين ما هو. والطرفين كان يمكن عندهم ادراك في مرحله معينه انه هذا مش بنهي احتلال، هذا بيعمل تماهي مع الاحتلال، هذا بيعمل آه، ببري ذمتي وبيعمل تبييض لذمتي انا كاي ان جي او حتى كحزب سياسي داعم للفلسطينيين في اي دوله ما. لكن في نفس الوقت انا بعرف انه هو ما بيحقق نوع من انواع الاستقلاليه للفلسطينيين. ولانه كمان مثل ما ذكرنا في السياق التاريخي احنا تحولنا للاسف جزء واسع، طبعا هو لا يعمم على الكل لكن جزء واسع، تحولنا للأسف من مؤسسات أهلية كانت تحمل في مرحلة معينة رسالة وطنية بحكم الحقبة اللي عشناها في آخر السبعين وأول الثمانين لنهاية الثمانين في الانتفاضة الأولى. تحولنا لمؤسسات بشكل أو بآخر بين مقتبسين نخبوية، طبعا كمان مش للتعميم لكن هذا الانطباع العام. فنعم هذا هو تعليقي على الملاحظة، هي الملاحظة في محلها لكن للأسف هي كمان بتاخذ بعد أوسع من مجرد توعية وإعادة تأهيل فيما يتعلق بالعمل الوطني والشعبي. شكرا.
شكرا عبد. I think that we can take a last question before that we go to Nadine. I don't know if our audience would like to ask, a last question to all of our speakers or one of them. طب okay. If we don't have questions, Nadine, the floor is yours. your last word and your recommendations in order to make sure that the role of the INGOs, is efficient and effective in supporting the local actors and everywhere in the world, not only in Palestine.
I think I'll first start by building off of the point around risk again that and Deborah circled back to that as well. Just to say that we are led by and guided by our partners in how we understand navigating risk as well. And that is often and we see now in this past year, many partners of ours, and this I think was mentioned by someone else, have chosen not to take funding from groups that have put out, from donors that have put out positions that are clearly explicitly Zionist, or who even have been silent. And these are groups that we know are in much more precarious financial situations than we are. They are at much higher risk when they lose funding than we might be in the global north. And that is the risk they choose to take because they are committed to something bigger than just a project or a program. I also want to name that, of course, it's not an easy choice to think about, okay, well, what does it mean if we lose funding today and we're not able to respond and provide support for basic needs for certain people in the community in order to try to push for a bigger political agenda. It's not an easy choice, and it shouldn't be that is a trade-off that it has to be made. But unfortunately, in the reality that we're in, it is a negotiation that we always have to be making, and we always have to be making with our partners on the ground. And it is also, we're always told by our partners, we will figure it out. Like, we need the money, but we also will figure it out. We're not going to sacrifice our principles and our vision for liberation for this money, right? And so I think this is also, the negotiation we have to always navigate in the imperialist neoliberal world we're in. And so we, MADRE, we're guided by this as well, and how we assess risk and how we think about risk. But yeah, I think my main point is just reiterating what I said before is there is a political role for INGOs to play, and that political role may look differently based on the position of the organization, based on the types of relationships it holds. It might be that it's a much more visible public thing. It might be that it's more behind closed doors and strategic, but these are critical questions that every INGO has to be asking itself and not shying away from. All the questions that Abdalaziz posed should be the guiding questions for any organization. The answers to those questions will look somewhat differently for each organization, but it's based on where they are. But not shying away from those questions is really my main maybe recommendation. And to just continue to center partners' voices and leadership in guiding what shifting power looks like in practice. Not to make that, because that is a risk that we can fall into as well in our pursuit of social justice and shifting power, is to also still make decisions on behalf of people on the ground about what that looks like when maybe they have other analyses to share with us that we need to be taking into account. So I'll pause here, but thank you again.
Thank you very much, Nadine. Actually, we got two questions. The first one is about your funding channels, I mean as MADRE. And it's been answered because actually the question is to all the speakers, but actually Russia Al-Jundi focused much on MADRE's fundraising channels. If it's, because you mentioned something about flexible sources of funding, and also in general, you mentioned something also about institutional donors, but she's asking about MADRE's fundraising channels other than crowdfunding. And there is another question about from Rasha Sansour. She asks if MADRE face relentless lobbying by Zionist organizations to stop funding in Palestine, particularly, in this time, in this situation.
So should I go? I'll go. Yes. So we I will say that we have not been directly impacted by the loss of funding for Palestine in the same ways that other groups have yet. We do not know what the trajectory will be. We are planning and anticipating that we will be impacted by these funding cuts, but up until now, we've managed to have some fundraising and that we are able to continue to do for Palestine. However, there are many groups in our similar kind of funds like us, intermediary funds, that have lost funding. One, because some of them have put out, MADRE puts out political statements in the framework of international law. Other groups have put out maybe what might be perceived as more radical statements, right? And those have been, there have been punitive measures from donors because of that, from their funders because of that. And these are private foundations that in the past was funding year in and year out. We're not talking even about governments right now, we're talking about private foundations, right? And we see that definitely government grants have restrictions. I think when we're talking about institutional grants from private philanthropy or foundations, there are restrictions, but they look different. And there's creative ways to get around it that we try to think about all the time, right? We try to position, we're fundraising for the region and try to think creatively of how we might allow resources to continue to flow so that we're not impacted by the restrictions that might come up. However, we know that there is current legislation that might be coming out that will create bigger barriers for moving money from here to Palestine. And we're already having to think creatively with our partners about how to get money to them in a way that won't be risky. And so that is part of the flexibility of sometimes we're going to send money to an individual, not to a registered organization. We also have partnerships with unregistered groups. It's not a requirement for our partnership. So there's ways to think about creatively navigating these restrictions, but they have to be kind of in conversation with the specific partners that we're working with and understanding the specific donor and what restrictions are coming out there. And I will just continue to say, like, there's a lot of creativity that needs to be involved in like navigating this, positioning the work. Sometimes it is strategic to frame the work from a humanitarian or relief lens, but we don't necessarily when we speak to donors, but that might not be the statements that we put out, right? And so I think finding the lines around that are important with depending on who we fundraise from. I'll pause here. I don't want to take up more space, and I'd love for Deborah and Abdalaziz to come in as well.
I just wanted to make one or two comments. On this issue of risk, I think it's saying who's really taking the risk, right? I think, donors and INGOs need to say, whose risk is this? Is it really us sitting in a comfy office in London or Geneva or Washington, or is it people on the ground? And risk needs to be negotiated and proportionate. So that's one thing. On the funding side, I mean, for INGOs who are getting in these millions and millions of dollars in appeals, the money that they raise from the general public is not subject to the same restrictions that the money that they raise from governments as subcontractors or UN agencies. So I think they need to be thinking a lot more creatively about how to spend those funds. And if they are feeling that because of charity law or anti-terrorism law or whatever regulations are imposed on them by their own governments that they haven't yet managed to lobby to change, it's something else they need to do. There are intermediary funds, many like MADRE, Dalia, and others. There are groups who are doing this creatively that they can pass funding through. And what they shouldn't do when they're doing that is cream a whole percentage off the top for themselves. They should just be working to support those ones that are much more locally connected, who do have the ability to give flexibly and openly. That's just what I wanted to say on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much all for your contributions. I did understand from my colleagues at Dalia that this webinar is the first of a series of webinars where they are going to address all the work of the local community organizations, including and also the international non-governmental organizations. I hope that we've been able, through these speakers and their experiences, to highlight the role of INGOs in supporting the local communities and how we can shift the power and how we can let's say, transfer the decision-making process to local actors and communities. And I hope to see you again in other opportunities. Thank you very much for all of you, Abdalaziz, Deborah, and Nadine. And thank you very much for Dalia for this webinar, you know, in which that I learned a lot of things about, you know, international cooperation, INGOs, and what has to be done at the local level. See you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
شكرا.
أهلا.